welcome everybody. I hope everyone can hear me. It's great to have you for this last Critical Antiquities workshop for session 1. And very happy to have Andrew Poe here. Before I introduce him, I'll acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're on today at the University of Sydney, pay respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and their elders. And I acknowledge that this land was stolen, sovereignty has never been ceded, and colonialism continues to display its devastating effects on First Nations people across this continent. I mourn this and commit myself to truth-telling, education, and practice where possible in order that some good may yet come. So Andrew Poe, our guest today, is Associate Professor at the Australian Catholic University in North Sydney. Andrew, more commonly known as Andy. I call you Andy in this format.
You sound like my relatives call me Andy.
It could be Dr. Poe, but
Andy is
good. So Andy is a political theorist whose research spans a diverse array of problems in democratic theory, especially modes of resistance, rhetoric, belief, religion, extremism, and political affects. Prior to his arrival in Sydney, and we're very glad that he's local, Andy was assistant professor of political science at Amherst College and part of the coordinating committee of the Amherst program in critical theory. He's held research fellowships at numerous places. I've learned of a couple more just today. So the University of Copenhagen, where he worked alongside my PhD supervisor, Lars Turner. He was a research fellow at the Divinity School at Harvard. And for all of that, he worked with Axel Honneth, the famed Institute for Social Research at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Andy has numerous articles and book chapters to his name, which testify to the exciting eclecticism and creativity of his work. But I'll single out his monograph, Political Enthusiasm, Partisan Feeling and Democracy's Enchantments, which was published with Manchester University Press in 2022, which offers a critical genealogy of the phenomenon of enthusiasm in politics. And he has 2 volumes that he's co-edited. One is The Time of Catastrophe, published by Routledge in 2015, and the other, The Lives of Guns, published with Oxford University Press in 2018. He's got a current research project, a big monograph. Big monograph? As a political theorist, yeah, okay. It could go either way. So 100 pages of intense density, or it could be, so this monograph explores the promise and complexity of democracy without police. And what's the working title? Democracy Without Police. Yeah. I like that. Straightforward. And his talk today, entitled Amongst Wolves on the Origin of Police, is from that project. So we're very happy to hear it, happy to hopefully contribute to its formation. And please join me in welcoming dear Andy.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Ben and Tristan. The title of this talk is Amongst Wolves on the Origins of Police. I should have added that S when I sent it. Okay. There were not long ago certain small children playing in a meadow together, hard by the town, where also some store of kine were feeding, many of them having young calves sucking upon them. And suddenly, amongst the children, comes this vile wolf running. It caught a pretty fine girl by the collar with the intent to pull out her throat. But the wolf could not pierce the collar of the child's coat, being high and very well stiffened and close clasped upon her neck. This was, as you can imagine, of course, terrifying for the children, who let out a sudden cry. Their screams so amazed the cattle feeding nearby that they came running, charging against the wolf with such force that he was presently compelled to let go his hold, run away to escape the danger of their horns. On its own, this narrative would be a remarkable story, but as the report continues, there was a group of hunters watching these events unfold from afar. Seeing the wolf escaping, they released their dogs to try to trap it. But just when the dogs had surrounded the wolf, it seemed to undo a kind of belt around its waist, whereby the shape of a wolf was, as it was reported, clean avoided, and a man appeared in his true shape and likeness. The hunters, whose eyes were steadfastly bent upon the beast, seeing him in the same place metamorphosized, contrary to their expectation, it wrought a wonderful amazement to their minds, and had it not been that they knew the man as soon as they saw him, they surely would have taken the same vision to have been some devil in a man's likeness. This account comes to us from a report on the crimes and trial of the serial killer Peter Stube, executed on October 31st, 1589. Stube was one of several reported werewolves wreaking havoc in Europe at this time. In 1605, Henry Gardine confessed to becoming a wolf and then kidnapping, murdering, and eating a small child. In 1574, Gilles Guénère was convicted and executed for attacking, killing, and eating several children in the guise of a wolf. At the end of the 16th century, werewolves were starting to become responsible for such heinous crimes as rape, incest, murder, savage attacks, and all forms of cannibalism, and were being tried in magisterial courts for such crimes across European states. These werewolf trials, while few and far between, became important signifiers, haunting a public imagination. The threat that homo homini lupus est, a human is a wolf to another human, was starting to become real, with important consequences for social and political life. Wolves once triggered a crucial anxiety in early domesticated human life. It is perhaps no surprise that many pre-modern myths problematize wolves as a fundamental danger both to flocks and to the human communities that relied upon them. As herds of sheep and goats proved crucial resources for meat and milk and cheese and clothing and tools, shepherding communities sought protection from such an existential threat. Security, it seems, was once synonymous with protection from wolves. As I hope to discuss today, the monstrous fantasy of werewolves was itself not an early modern European invention, but in fact part of a longer history of an anxiety that has shaped political thinking. Politics in the West has, at least in part, developed along an anxiety regarding wolves, and this anxiety forms in a dialectic that eventually produces the modern invention of the police. We might have forgotten that the police are very modern, all too modern an institution. Before the 17th century, it would be difficult to speak about the police in a way that would be in any way recognizable to us today. The police as a formal political institution historically originated around, it seems, shared desires for the preservation of property or the maintenance of social order. Whether in the slave patrols of the colonial American South or the protective policing of royal exports in the harbor of London, early police forces existed to protect property in the civil order of moneyed interests. But paired with these desires for specific protections was an equally powerful anxiety that the police would serve the communities they protect rather than turn against them. This anxiety has concrete and mythic origins in pre-modern human concern for the preservation of flocks. And as this talk aims to illustrate, that anxiety seems to have transformed over time, from an anxiety regarding wolf attacks to a fantastic fear of werewolves, and finally, perhaps, to police themselves occupying the very place of this wolfish guise. As modern police forces have transformed pedagogical structures from their protection of communities to the very protection of police, as has been documented since the 1970s, increased police killings and attacks on civilians reveal that police may have become what we might name as contemporary werewolves, fulfilling the very anxiety that the police were invented to encounter. My discussion today maps some of the origins of this desire for security by tracing the beginning of the concept of the police. As I hope to show, the wolf is such a crucial character in the dialectical origin story of the police because it provides an exterior force to counteract and develop against. Ancient iterations of police, always included in the security forces of the state, had the maintenance of the boundary of the state as a crucial function. This boundary was both the perimeter of civil order and the perimeter of the human world, and the human world safe from wolves. I want to argue that as police power transforms, so too does the problem of the wolf. From religious figurations of the wolf as evil to bourgeois lessons in moral psychology and the growth of civil administration, the figure of the wolf continues to occupy a significant place in the psychic space of civil society. And as police develop from a segment of security forces to civil administration and then an independent political institution, the contrast to wolves remains constant. In this way, I want to try to offer a portrait of a world before police, at least police as recognizable to us today, and the ways that this before has found itself continuing in justifications of both the constitution of the police as a security force, as well as the continuation and expansion of the powers of that force. Read this way, fear of specific manifestations of disorder, wolves, can help explain the beginning of the developmental logic of policing. This talk, just so you can keep track, is divided into three parts. The first is where I offer an account of this ancient anxiety regarding wolves, which is, in a sense, centered on a slow, close reading of a core sentence that appears in Book 2 of Plato's Republic. His expression of a generalized worry that we might not be able to distinguish wolves from dogs. Attention to this particular instance of animality, I think, proves crucial, both to Plato's project as a whole, but also as a window into a certain kind of political thinking. The rest of the talk revolves around this kernel as it develops and takes root in a growing political imaginary. I build a bridge from it in part 2 to the danger of wolves and the impulse to police, tracing some ways along with Foucault in which ancient pastoral power forms around the wolf. And in the third section, I gesture towards an underlying logic of division that comes from this dialectic, how wolves and police form each other, including with some thoughts on how to begin to orient ourselves to this very logic. So, to begin, Plato's Republic can certainly have many centers of gravity or orientation points that we might use to enter into the thinking of how else politics can be, how else justice can be, how else the just person can be, how else the city can be. In Book 2, we encounter a narrative of political life where Socrates struggles to respond to a very particular desire. Glaucon sets out a desire that justice be a good thing, that it, in some sense, fulfills his desire to be what he imagines it could be. And in response to this desire, Socrates describes what sounds to Glaucon and many readers to be a rather austere city. The beginning of the project of thinking about justice in a serious way that takes place in Book 2 is often described as the beginning of the project of thinking about the polis, thinking about the city, and how we might imagine it to be ordered. The first narrative of the city of necessity, as we might present it, is a city described as beginning in the bare needs of life, the essential needs of those who participate in the city. And from this origin, the conversation develops, more and more shaped by Glaucon's desire for the city to be a certain way. The polis emerges as not yet or not enough of itself to Glaucon's imagination when it is simply in our bare need, when it is simply there for the providing of food and shelter and clothing and shoes and maybe medicine. It needs more than that in order to be a polis, in order to be ordered, in order to be what we would recognize as the center of communal life. That city transforms into what is described as the heavenly city, or the second city, a city that is more recognizable to Glaucon and to us as readers, a city that has not just one person with one task, which is distinguished in its purity, but many people with tasks that are mixed in their structure. The very fabric of necessity that oriented the first positions in the city starts to devolve. Socrates describes a point where the need of persons' work becomes unapparent, undescribable, unlocatable. Do we know that we need a chef as opposed to someone who merely cooks food? How do we recognize need in that distinction between the mere presence of bare life and its necessities and the luxuries that adorn those necessities? It's in the midst of this development where we start to approach something of the edge of the city, the edge of the polis. That is, the limits at which the city can be recognizable to itself. This edge starts to encroach on the edges of other cities, other communities, other politics. A city that exceeds its necessity and its wants starts to colonize, starts to invade, starts to take on warlike structures. And it's in the midst of that encroachment that we encounter a very particular problem and a very specific puzzle. Towards the end of Book 2, Plato, in the voice of Socrates, articulates the following anxiety. Surely the most terrible and most shameful thing in the world for shepherds is to rear dogs as auxiliaries to help them with their flocks in such a way that those dogs themselves, because of intemperance, hunger, or some other bad condition, try to do evil to the sheep, acting like sheepdogs, not like sheepdogs, but like wolves. This becomes, by some readings of the Republic, a crucial orientation point insofar as Socrates is introducing, or rather reintroducing, language of a way in which judgment becomes crucial to how we experience the polis. In The analogy to dogs as opposed to wolves, so the story usually goes. The city needs to employ a space for guardians, those who are able uniquely to look at the world in fundamentally opposing ways, to conceive of the world as being able to be something that is of necessity and not of necessity, to conceive of the world as being able to be something which is both visible to us as dangerous on the one hand, outside, threat, harm, and interior, safe, controlled, friendly. What eventually becomes the seed for a kind of distinction between friend and enemy, and is itself a rephrasing of Paul Marcus's articulation in Book 1 of justice as helping friends and harming enemies. The guardians, and in fact the education of the guardians, becomes the framework for much of the rest of the Republic. How would we ever teach anyone to think in fundamentally opposing ways? To think not just that my position is to protect, but also that my position is to attack. My position is both simultaneously at the edge or the boundary of political life itself. From Plato's perspective, I think that question of the education of the guardian is a seed to the education of both the ruler, but also of the reader, in an understanding of the complexities of justice, the complexities of seeing in a multiplicity of perspectives. But I think there's a way that we can also imagine, sort of alongside Plato, even if not identical to his thinking, of this moment as articulating a very specific figuration of a logic of policing. In order to encounter that logic, it might help us to think through the countervailing forces that present themselves within this passage, the dog and the wolf. Within this moment of the text, when the city has reached its very edge, we encounter a figure who also resides at the very limits of the city, the shepherd. The shepherd who exists outside of, but in service of, the community who exists for the luxurious experience of communal life. And it's this shepherd who becomes the site of pedagogical narrations. The dog is an aid to the shepherd, an extension of the shepherd, and required to navigate the world of the shepherd outside the city, but with the capacity to return to the city, to enter the city. A dog in this instance is in the service of others, but a dog in this instance is also meant to figure in a particular way for the defense of the sheep. Dogs, it is said, can be miseducated or can have impulses that might lead them to other figurations of themselves because of intemperance or hunger or some other bad condition, so Plato says. These are capacities that are already present within the dog. But because of those present capacities, so too is a present identity, the lurking or lingering possibility that the dog can become a wolf. In that sense, the wolf is not something other than a dog, but rather the double of the dog, or the manifestation of the dog that is not quite dog. In that presentation, we start to notice what has already in the Republic become a building anxiety about what is on the exterior of the polis, what is beyond the limit of polis. And here we encounter a figure which, in the way that it develops, is possible to be at that edge, to travel within the city, and also to figure a kind of exterior monstrousness of beyond the city itself. This then shouldn't surprise us when later on, when we encounter different constitutions of political life, that we meet a new figuration of the wolf. Plato says in Book 8, isn't it the same with a popular leader? Once he really takes over a docile mob, he doesn't restrain himself from shedding a fellow citizen's blood, but by leveling the usual false charges and bringing people into court, he commits murder. And by blotting out a man's life, his impious tongue and lips taste kindred blood. Then he banishes and kills and drops hints about the cancellation of debts and the redistribution of land. And after that, isn't such a man inevitably fated to be killed by his enemies or to be a tyrant, transformed from a man into a wolf? Here, we don't just encounter the dog as wolf, but we now encounter the man as wolf, the man who has become what was not yet able to enter into the city or should not have been allowed to come into the city. Now, in the very center of the city, in the very experience of the center of the polis, the leader of a certain sort of politics is described as becoming a wolf. Becoming a wolf in what sense? Becoming a wolf that responds to human life with pure cruelty, that responds to human life in such a way that it murders, that it blots out other life. This second iteration of the wolf, the man as wolf, sheds light also on the previous iteration of wolf. If the dog could become a wolf in the earlier articulation, we might wonder what is the contrast between the man that becomes dog and the man that becomes wolf. How does the man that becomes wolf experience wolfishness? Is there anything to avoid it? And is there any escape from it once one enters into that condition? There is, of course, a sort of clear link between the tyrant's animality and a sort of fantasy of sovereignty that we might hear echoes of. Derrida and Rousseau both remind us of this fantasy of superiority that could manifest itself in different ways. From their perspective, the sovereign thinks to itself. As a shepherd is of nature superior to that of his herd, the shepherd of men who are chiefs are also of a nature superior to that of their peoples. This, according to Philon, was how Caligula reasoned, correctly confusing from his analogy that kings were gods and that peoples were like beasts. But it's exactly in that confusion that another boundary confusion manifests itself. And here Derrida is particularly useful. In the being outside or at the edge of law that the dog and the wolf and the shepherd occupy, there is a kind of reciprocality. As Derrida puts it, these figures call on each other and recall each other from one to the other. There is, between sovereign and criminal and beast, a sort of obscure and fascinating complicity, or even a worrying mutual attraction, a worrying familiarity, and unheimlich, an uncanny reciprocal haunting. It is precisely that haunting that I'm especially interested in. That is, the ways in which Plato's articulation of the wolf might start to haunt our experience of political life. We see it already, I think, in the very first instance of the contrast between dog and wolf. This contrast is a division. The dog is divided from the wolf. It should not be the wolf. It should be delineated from the wolf. At the very edge that divides the city from what is not the city, we meet a second division, the dog that should not become the wolf. In that logic of division, I think we start to meet a certain way in which wolves figure, but also a way in which police might start to manifest themselves. This is part one. Part two, wolves were once a central anxiety for early domesticated life. Herds of sheep and goats were crucial to resources such as meat and milk and cheese and clothing and tools. The development of wolves alongside humans has an equally lengthy record to the anthropological record of these bare human anthropological conditions. Thus, it's no surprise, I hope, that many pre-modern myths problematize wolves as a fundamental danger, both to flocks and to human communities that rely upon them. Jim Scott, for example, has argued that we are as much a product of self-domestication in both intended and unintended ways as other species of the domus are products of our domestication. Nowhere is this perhaps more obvious than the dog, nor with the absence of the wolf. As another historian elaborates, hostility towards wolves began with the emergence of animal husbandry. They were natural enemies of the early herdsmen, though wolves almost never attacked humans. They preyed on livestock, especially sheep. Guarding their flocks at night, shepherds would peer into the darkness, terrified that one of their sheep might be carried off. The slightest noise was enough to scare them. This does sort of beg the question how exactly wolves became monsters, given all the other threats that might have manifested themselves. Certainly, there are, both in literature and the history of philosophy, figurations of wolves as something dangerous. Preceding Plato's articulation, we might think of the wolfish rage that Hector experiences in Book 9 of the Iliad. As Greg Nagy has articulated it, when Hector experiences his own moment of wolfish rage, it is said that Lycia literally enters his body and pervades it completely. After Hector kills Patroclus and puts on the armor of Achilles that Patroclus had been wearing, Zeus seals Hector into the armor, and then the war god Ares himself literally enters into him, possessing him completely. So when Achilles finally kills Hector, he is in effect killing the embodiment of Ares, the war god. He's also maybe killing a figuration of a werewolf. But this narrative starts to mix with broader senses of politics and the power of sovereignty. We don't need simply to look to Homer to imagine forms of the monstrous as associated with wolves. From Calvin and Luther to Hobbes and Bodine and Rousseau, early modern narratives of sovereignty and state power seem to revolve around wolves. In his sermon on Deuteronomy 267, for example, Calvin exclaimed, "When we will not be ruled by God, then we will no longer discern between white and black, between men who seem to us to be wolves, and all things are out of order, and justly so." Similarly, Hobbes at the beginning of De Cive reminds us all kings are to be reckoned amongst ravenous beasts. Indeed, there would always be wolves and deprivators of liberty unless the forest that lodged them were grubbed up by the roots. To speak impartially, both sayings are very true, that man to man is a kind of God, and that man to man is an errant wolf. The narrative of the danger of wolves continues from the ancient to the modern world, with the invention of the state itself bound up in narratives that emphasize the boundary of the human and the animal. The interiorization of this anxiety becomes apparent in Freud's analysis of the bourgeois psyche and the complexities of the wolfman. Here, the wolf has gone from the force outside to the force inside, occupying both a psychic narrative but also a figurative form in the fairy tales used to educate the moral psychology of bourgeois children. The wolf seems to seed here a crucial anxiety. This anxiety has concrete and mythic origins in pre-modern human concerns, and it is paired with a narrative of policing of boundaries, division of boundaries, and separations of boundaries. The anxiety, in other words, seems to be itself the anxiety of not just how to divide, but how we experience division. Part of the depths of this anxiety manifest themselves, I think, in narrations, not of the wolf themselves, but of the shepherd. Foucault's accounts of pastoral power are well documented. His lectures on the pastoral are often used to articulate the limits of governing and government. But he is as concerned, I think, about questions of security and policing as somehow other than or on the edge of politics in a very specific way that draws together the shepherd, police, and the wolf. He reminds us that the idea of pastoral power is the idea of power exercised on a multiplicity rather than on a territory. It is a power that guides towards an end and functions as an intermediary towards this end. As opposed to the sovereign who might be captain of a ship, who has to navigate that ship to safe harbor, we encounter an alternative narration of power in the shepherd who guides the flock. As Foucault puts it, the shepherd does everything for the totality of his flock. He does everything also for each sheep of the flock. And it is here that we come to the famous paradox of the shepherd. On the one hand, the shepherd must keep an eye on all and on each, omnis et signalatum, which will be the great problem both of the techniques of power in Christian pastorship and of the, let's say, modern techniques of power deployed in the technologies of population. The second form taken by the paradox of the shepherd is the problem of the sacrifice of the shepherd for his flock, the sacrifice of himself for the whole of his flock, and the sacrifice of the whole of his flock for each of the sheep. Part of what Foucault calls our attention to is the activity of shepherding as distinct from the activity of navigating the ship, piloting the ship. Certainly, the language of piloting has become crucial to modern narratives of the ship of state, the directing of government, the ordering of structures. But in those narratives, what Foucault calls to our mind is the danger that, above all else, the ship captain's task is to get that ship to safe harbor. If that means the sacrificing of sailors or the sacrificing of anything present on the ship, that is beside the point. The ship itself to safe harbor is the task of the pilot. The shepherd, by contrast, lives and owes everything to the flock. The shepherd is responsible then for the whole of the flock and for each and every sheep. This is made especially apparent by a fundamental danger, the danger of what Foucault narrates as lapsy. The sheep that strays from the flock. The sheep that strays causes a scandal, Foucault says, or whose corruption is in danger of corrupting the whole flock, must be abandoned or may be excluded or chased away. Yet there's a paradox here that the salvation of a single sheep calls for us much care from the pastor, as much as does the whole flock. There is no sheep for which he must not suspend all his other responsibilities and occupations. Abandon the flock and try to bring it back. Bringing back the stray and bleeding sheep was not just a theoretical theme. From the first centuries of Christianity, it was a fundamental practical problem. When one needed to know what to do about the lapsy, those who had renounced the church. Should one abandon them once and for all, or go in search of them wherever they were or had fallen? Bringing back the stray and bleeding sheep becomes a figuration for a certain kind of politics, but it opens us up also to a certain kind of policing. Reading the shepherd not as sovereign, but as a kind of origin of police, the bringing back of the stray and bleeding sheep may open us up to an articulation of an experience that highlights just how dangerous the wolf might be. The sheep is the flock. They take on the totality of the flock. And the flock takes on the totality of the polis. It is the necessities of the polis that the shepherd provides. And thus, by protecting that which is at the very boundary of the city, the very boundary of life, the shepherd, by protecting the stray and bleeding sheep, the sheep that is lapsy, the sheep that is lost, the shepherd protects the city itself. There is a kind of motion or fluidity then in how far the shepherd's powers extend. And certainly we might have an anxiety that this applies to sovereign power. This is usually how Foucault is read. But I think there is also an anxiety that, at least internal to the functioning of the state, this also applies to police power. That police power is also involved in the activity of bringing back the stray and bleeding sheep. What does this exactly mean in more concrete forms? How would we understand this early articulation of the shepherd as a kind of police? It certainly provides a contrast to the usual articulations of ancient proto-police we might have in mind. The cohorts urbanae from Augustus's Praetorian Guard, for example, or the posse comitatus. These are, in the Roman world, pointed to as early articulations of police insofar as they are involved in what looks to be a sort of public security, or the narratives, mythic or otherwise, of the Scythian archers, slaves that were to have guarded public space within Athenian life. But in both of these instances, what we find is a subsection of martial existence. That is, we find the ordering and structure of military life turned to the particular task of navigating the interior of the polis. This doesn't figure as a distinctive police force, but rather as a police task, an opportunity to do a kind of security within the state itself. In fact, the name policing doesn't take on any associations with criminality or the structure of crime until much later. Most of what the cohorts urbana or the Scythian archers or the other figurations we might encounter in the ancient world that might look as proto-policing end up doing is standing fully in the service of security for a particular public moment. In Athens in particular, policing was very much following on Solon's reforms, a private matter, private activity. And that continues long up until the werewolf trials. It was the responsibility of individuals to engage in the private function of policing. At most, you could report crimes having been committed to someone else. You could report crimes to a magistrate or to a sheriff or to a constable. In the same way that you could report that a fire had taken place and that your farm had burned down, you could report that someone had been murdered. But that was the extent of those services. There was not the investigation of crime, nor of the possibility of preventing crime from happening before it had been committed. Those logics manifest later in and through a project of division that begins in the alternative narrative of policing we normally would associate with civic administration. That is, if we leave the ancient world and move into medieval or early modern periods of European history, we encounter the police not as solving crime, but as census takers, as road maintenance, as involved in the orientation and structure of the bureaucracies of the city, the circulation of goods and services. In order to do that, it seems police become something involved in the maintenance of boundaries and divisions. We see this in specific ways. More modern forms of policing exhibit violence work in the detection of prevention of crime. Such work would have been the work of militaries, at least before the modern nation state. Policing in its earliest forms was more concerned with administration, the preservation of the state, eventually, which could mean the prevention of crime, but it used to mean just the maintenance of the circulation of goods and commerce, a tallying of census to confirm the flow of humanity in and through cities. In his theses on politics, Rancière, I think, offers us an important touchstone to navigate this development, a distinction he wants to make between politics and policing. He says in his theses that there are two ways of counting the parts of the community that exist. The first counts real parts only, actual groups defined by differences in birth and by the different functions and places and interests that make up the social body, to the exclusion of every supplement. The second, in addition to this, counts a part of those without part. I call the first police and the second politics. From that perspective, the essence of the police, it lies neither in repression or control, but in a certain way of dividing up the world, of dividing up what is sensible, of dividing up who gets included and excluded. Similarly to the division between dog and wolf, policing seems to exhibit itself as a kind of dividing logic. It is the dividing as opposed to the guarding of what is divided. Rather than presupposing that the police was already recognizable to us as a particular institution then with a concrete historical reality, I share Rancière's hope to encounter us with a concept of the police. In this way, the police is best understood as a way of counting, one which counts the real parts of the community that exist. This way of counting is contrasted with politics, which is a way of counting which counts parts without part. Attuning us to ways of counting, Rancière shows us the essence of the essence of police rests in the ordering and division of the sensible. The police is always in service of defining the hierarchies that surround us within a given order of rule, making clear who counts as ruler and who counts as ruled. By highlighting for us new ways of understanding the names police and politics, Rancière begins a kind of disordering of the police in the normal order of things, offering us a chance to enter into a kind of political thinking on such orders. In this way, he also helps us begin to critique the very idea of the police, especially if we consider that critique can be a kind of wrestling with, as opposed to a domination or a simple destruction. Moving through these snapshots, we start to encounter a dialectic which I think is developing, one where the ancient experience of wolves becomes an anxiety of wolves, and from that anxiety, it extends to the very fear that human beings become like wolves. At the very end of the history of private policing, when each of us would be responsible for monitoring our own private experience with criminality, police forces start to emerge in and around the history of the werewolf trials. It is as though the two share a unique historical moment. As crime extends itself or accentuates itself, we notice a sort of severity in these instances of criminality. And it's in this moment that policing arrives on the scene historically as something more recognizable to us involved with crime. Even the instance I began this lecture with, Peter Stuba's attempted murder of this young girl in the highlands of Germany, was a moment when policing did not yet exist. The group of hunters that capture and submit him to the magistrate are not police as such, but simply a private group concerned with the lives of their own children. While we may not often think of it this way, police are a complex array of sociological phenomena, an institution, community of officers, and an idea. Each has a distinct, but I think interrelated history. So when we speak about police today, it can seem to be difficult to not have the figure of this uniformed officer lurking in our imagination. Yet the history of this figure and their purported authority and the function and activity of their work within contemporary society is not coincident with the present figure, nor, I would argue, need it be in the future. Considering policing as a learned set of activities, the learning of policing provides a standardization of tactics, a monitoring of practices, and the preparation of police for the work of their profession in modern articulations. As with any profession, the tasks and activities that make up policing today have not always been a part of that work. Where once police built roads or conducted census, contemporary policing now includes what we would call violence work. Considering policing as work allows us an understanding of core elements of how these elements have been managed. new elements of policing emerge, and so too do new practices and new cultures. Violence work has brought important risks and differences to police life. Being paid to enter into unhealthy situations where one faces physical or psychological harm requires significant training. But because it is also work, those who engage in it rightly have demanded training and protections from the risk these harms pose. The profession of policing has evolved along, from this very standpoint, militarized lines, where the patrol has taken on key aspects of the squadron and the platoon. Where once police would have been encouraged to protect the lives of citizens, military units learned to protect themselves. In this way, policing has evolved, and a key aspect of these trainings has begun to emerge. In what is now commonly referred to as the first rule of law enforcement, many police have been trained to protect themselves and other police first. Crucial to this violent work of policing and the shifts in structure it has produced has been the important question of who police work is now for. Where once police forces were primarily volunteer services, parallel to volunteer fire departments, as policing has become more professional, there has been an unforeseen consequence of police becoming separated from the communities they patrol. In this way, they may perhaps become dangerously close to becoming werewolves.
Well, actually, that was a remarkable, I would even say tour de force through a kind of genealogy of the police. And I've got so many questions and ideas that I've jotted down here that I would take half the day to get through them, and I'm not going to trouble this forum with I'm not certainly not going to subject you to those questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to our audience for questions in the first instance, and if we have any time left, I might throw a few of my own into there. Let's take a question from Zoom first. If there's any, wonderful Bob. Bob Cowan has the first question as always. Tristan, do you want to just tap the screen?
Oh yeah, back up. Wake it up.
Just there we go. Hi Bob, far away.
Hi there. Well, many thanks for that. That was absolutely wonderful, as Ben says. This may be an unfair question, but I was just wondering, I mean, inevitably the wolf paradigm is predicated on societies which have contact with and experience of wolves. I wondered if you'd looked into any sort of transcultural notions. I mean, in Africa, in Australia, in South America, are there different or comparable paradigms predicated on relationships with other predatory animals?
That's a great question. I mean, it does turn out that wolves are particularly wide-ranging. So certainly they are almost as wide-ranging on the globe as humans are. And from Africa or at least parts of Africa and Australia and Latin America, we see these encounters. One of the things I've been paying more attention to are some of the different cultural reactions. So it's certainly the case that we could say in the Roman world, there's a variation in the response to wolves. So sometimes wolves figure as a kind of model of heroism, and sometimes they figure as a kind of model of danger within Roman narratives. So there is probably a more complicated explanation. But if we look, for example, at the Iroquois First Nations tribe in the United States, the Iroquois have a narrative of the wolf, which is entirely different from this narrative. And part of it is bound up in a specific history of encounter with wolves that was, as anthropologists have reported in any way, quite destructive. And as a response, it wasn't thought that the wolf was an enemy to be eradicated or to be expunged, but rather that the wolf needed to have representation within council efforts. So the wolf, rather than the wolf becoming exteriorized, the wolf became interiorized as something which could be represented. So in most of the Iroquois councils, the wolf has a representative who speaks the voice of the wolf. In recent articulations of the limits of certain politics within the Anthropocene, where there's been a desire to find representations of rivers or representations of forests or oceans, this seems to me to be on parallel, but far preceding it historically. Another counterexample might be the Japanese experience of the wolf. So in Japanese culture, the wolf isn't exteriorized in the same way that it's enemy, but it's maybe encountered as that which could be worshipped. So the word for wolf, okari, like means something like great God. Like it's articulated itself as great God and is encountered as something to be worshipped as opposed to expunged. So this narrative of the wolf as dangerous is a very particular one, but certainly that haunts much of the Western world and its contours with policing. At least that's the speculation.
That's fantastic. Are there any more questions from Zoom? Does anyone have any questions at all? Tristan, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just trying to, you go first, Ben.
Well, Dan, you have a question.
Please.
Yeah.
So I'm a medievalist, and wolves are very complicated natures. And
Yeah.
even going back to Antiquities, obviously you've got Romulus, you've got nurturing wolf.
Yeah.
Which is it doesn't do your argument, obviously. But I was just thinking something that sort of goes with what you were saying. It's in the little flowers of St. Francis Bulbio,
Yeah.
which is it's very much sort of doing a deal with the wolf.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you want to talk about that one? That's just...
Yeah, so I only know that narrative slightly, but as I understand it, the way it's presented, the wolf is someone that has to be negotiated with, right?
Yeah, so the wolf is attacking the citizens and
Right.
as they leave the walls of the city, and citizens are getting sick of it and they want something done. They go after the wolf. And St. Francis, of course, who's on the side of the wolf almost,
Right.
comes and mediates
Yeah.
and breaks an agreement between the wolf and the people of the town of Bulbio, and says, well, if you feed the wolf, he will not only not attack you, but protect you.
Yeah.
Almost like an ideology of the dog, right?
Well, it's the wolf and the dog coming from the other side.
Yeah.
Turning the wolf into the dog.
Yeah, I've seen, I mean, that period of history isn't my area, so it's hard to speak about it, but I have seen,
Which also
I've seen that portrait.
So the development of sort of St. Francis and the rise of the mercantile, the growth of capitals, the growth of town.
Right.
So there's a lot that's going on.
Yeah, no,
There's a
that's
lot
great.
politically that sort of the wolf is right there as a part of the thinking, mythologized
Yeah.
social interaction.
Yeah, I love the idea that the town starts to invite the wolf in a certain sort of way.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
And the wolf reciprocates, so it's less of an animal.
Yeah.
It becomes shepherd almost.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's useful, especially as a sort of precursor to this later, like, becoming werewolf argument. So one of the elements I couldn't really talk about, but is on my mind to when this becomes a chapter, is this distinction between wolf and werewolf that it is hard to narrow down. But if the wolf becomes less than animal, it becomes something like on the other side of werewolf. Like, werewolf seems to be becoming more than animal, at least as we encountered in the werewolf trials. Like, the human that is animal is then animal and more than animal. So the more then becomes important to the danger of the werewolf. Whereas this narrative maybe invites us to consider the other side of that, like the invitation in. That's great.
I'll a quick follow up on that one. I don't know this story, but I know Gubbio and I know Assisi, and they're different cities. Is it significant that St. Francis, being from Assisi, is narrating this about Gubbio? Like, what's the politics
Well, it's
between those
intervening,
two
intervening
cities?
in Gubbio, yeah.
Okay.
Is he asked to be a mediator, is he?
I'm not sure if I think he might be asking the story actually. Yeah,
Right.
I kind of think so.
So he himself is the outsider who comes in.
Yeah,
to,
he's not
It's a very chosen thing.
yeah, yeah.
to me yet.
It's fascinating.
We have a question on Zoom from Fraser.
Hey, yeah. Thanks, Andrew, for the talk. It was really great. I had a quick question about your mention of Rancière towards the end of the
Mhm.
talk. And I think you're right. His concept of police is really useful for the sort of historical investigation of the development of the concept of police in general. I was wondering if you had looked into, because he has his own specific take on Plato's notion of politics, specifically in the Republic, as the kind of politics as the education of the public of the ethos or the ethical principle, the rational principle of the community that holds everything together. Um, and part of that analysis, or at least part of the analysis for Rancière, involves Plato's distinction between souls of particular individuals
Mhm.
and essentially the allotting of people to their proper place according to their soul, right? To their nature in some sense. And so I was looking at that wolf passage you mentioned at the end of book 2 of the Republic. And it seems to me that there, what Plato is concerning himself with is the guardian by nature is in some sense a wolf. It has the characteristics of the wolf, the soul of the wolf. And it is up to the shepherd, which in this case I would interpret as the philosopher king, essentially, in this context, the one with the soul to educate, who has access to the good, the ethos of the community, the proper principle of communal organization. And it is up to them to teach the wolf how to be a guardian, essentially, a police, right? Because they talk about, they need to have a proper philosophical disposition. How do we give something which has the nature of the wolf a proper philosophical disposition? We need philosophers. We need the philosopher king who has access to the good.
Ultra 03
Ignore that. So yeah, just wondering basically what you would think about Rancière's own interpretation of Plato's politics, which is essentially, just for Rancière anyway, it's just a conflation of politics with police, right?
Yeah.
In this particular context.
No, that's a great question. I have to say, I have struggled with Rancière's take. On the one hand, I think his reading of the cobbler is one of the great interpretations of Plato. So the chapter from the philosopher and his poor, where at least he wants to take seriously Plato's language, that how the cobbler manifests itself is very important to creating a space for the philosopher, creating a space for something in the city other than work. I think that's incredibly important. I also, I don't think I think he's reading Plato in other ways quite flatly. And so I don't quite know how to balance it. And I guess I worry that part of that flatness comes from a sort of inherited reading of Plato, that we often want to read him as an anti-democrat in some way. And I have a lot of trouble reading him that way. I think if we take seriously the kind of reading Rancière is doing for the cobbler and we apply it broadly to the Republic, we encounter a text which is struggling to present to us the complexity of how you would encounter someone who has a fundamentally different notion of political life from you, and Glaucon and Socrates that are in tension with each other. And what Socrates is trying to do at the beginning, helping Glaucon see what he already sees, becomes a failed project that then develops into an effort to share in something. So by the time we get to 7, 8, 9, and 10, there's an effort to share in thinking. How does that apply to this question? I think it's true. The shepherd does figure as a kind of educator at the end of book 2, and maybe this is something that requires more attention as I sort of tighten and strengthen this chapter. But rather than imagining the early articulations of policing as being responsible for security, being the dog, I almost want to imagine the early figurations of policing as being the shepherd, and that the shepherd is sort of not the philosopher. Like, it looks like the philosopher, but it isn't the philosopher. And what we encounter then in the Republic is learning who else the philosopher can be besides the shepherd. Something like that. I'm taking your question maybe too seriously, but I think I'm on the same page as you in terms of how important it is. But it's something that I haven't fully articulated to myself. So, but I definitely want to think more about. I don't know if that is a start to an answer, but.
No, absolutely. That's a great response. Yeah, I suppose just to follow up on that a little bit, there does seem at least a kind of suspicion of, because I think what Roncier is trying to point out at least is that in Plato there is a certain need for a master to tell the people, how they should function, what's their proper place in society, how they should act, and all that sort of thing. And that requires a kind of broad education.
Right. And it's exactly that I'm thinking, at least in Plato, that's what Glaucon wants. And Socrates is having trouble not being that and being that at the same time. And he's trying to find his way out of being that. Like, he's trying to find his way out of being the master. So it's philosopher kings, and kings will be philosophers. Like, it's the plural as opposed to the singular. Like, he uses all sorts of linguistic devices to signal that Socrates' thinking is maybe more expansive than Glaucon is able to admit. And I think we as readers have just been incentivized to read like we're Glaucon. So we sort of fall into the position of, I'm reading a book about justice. I want to know what justice is. Tell me what it is. I want. And part of the book is then problematizing that want without us maybe being explicit about it. So.
Yeah. But then I guess the problem just becomes how to place the discourse on the souls, right? Because it very clearly divides people into.
He clearly does divide them, I think, as part of the education that's in the structure of the development of that city. So. Yeah, we can argue about Plato maybe another time.
Sure, thanks.
I have a few observations and perhaps a question buried in there somewhere. In a really important paper, 1968, Francis Vien on war and the warrior in Greek myth draws attention to the fact that there is this sort of figure of warrior communities in early Greek myth and early Greek thought, which are in opposition to the city, the war in the city, so that the ordered hoplite phalanx, who is subordinate to the interests of the city and who is disarmed within the boundaries of the city and only takes up arms outside. But this is the Roman distinction between domi and litiaque and so on. Right? The warrior group that sits outside the city is the Agale, right, the pack, the wolf pack. And this is where the warrior starts to incarnate the wolfish qualities, right? The Lisa that we referred to before, the berserker, the wolfish rage. And the idea of incorporating warrior groups back into the city, reintegrating, to domesticating, in other words, is an interesting task of early lawgivers. You know, it occurs to me, for instance, that the word agale, which means flock, also is the word for pack, wolf pack.
Oh wow,
Right,
that's awesome.
so it's both, and it particularly features in early Greece as a term used for adolescent males for undergoing rites of passage. Right, and we know that werewolfism or lycanthropy is a motif of rites of passage. Right, so Zeus Lycaos, the sanctuary of Zeus Lycaos in Arcadia, Zeus the wolf, was a place of werewolf, where young men went out into the wilderness, became wolves, only to return after a period of kind of liminality, right? So they adopted wolf-like characteristics. And the wolf pack too becomes a motif for the adolescent male group that refuses integration back into the city, right? So it goes out, it has a period of liminal exile, but then doesn't reintegrate, becomes a kind of, wild group of young men. And the reintegration of the agale is a really important aspect of some anthropological interpretations of early Greece. So particularly Sparta, and of course the name of the lawgiver in Sparta, Lycurgus, means the one who wards off the wolf. Right. And so the idea that the formation of the early Greek city is a matter of the domestication of the warrior, and the turning of the warrior into a citizen. But it matches beautifully with what you're saying. Because you're talking about division and distribution. And Détienne and Svembro have this idea of the impossible cities, the city that is made up of wolves, right? Because wolves, as a pack, they know how to fight together. But the one thing they can't do together is they can't fairly distribute equal portions. So equal distribution of portions of the hunt, which is what in fable is the origin of koinonia, community, can't take place amongst wolves, because wolves can only divide according to the logic of the alpha wolf, who is the tyrannos, the tyrant. So that's why tyranny becomes a motif, a wolfish motif as well, because the tyrant would just overwhelm the political distribution of the city by just taking everything for himself through using violence. So I guess all of that all just plays beautifully into what you've been saying. It just confirms for me. But my question was, you're absolutely spot on when you talk about policing being a private matter for the bulk of the last 5,000 years. Why does it cease to be a private? When and under what historical circumstances, like, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but just as a kind of gut feeling, do you think that this is happening around about the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century? Is it state power? Is that, what's going on there?
So, first of all, the side notes are incredibly useful, and it's great to think about the overlapping. And I think my answer my answer to the question sort of builds upon it in two ways. One, the warrior coming back into the city is not just an ancient problem, like it's a continual problem.
Sure.
And I think at least one of the stories that we often hear about the development of policing in a recognizable form to one we would see today is the return of warriors to London in and around this period after the Civil War and the various wars in Germany. All of a sudden you have large numbers of mercenaries that are skilled in labor and as Christopher Hill describes them, sort of vagabonds, right? So they are without home. And one of the things that they end up getting employed to do is monitoring the Port of London, partly because there's an anxiety, I think, that the royalty has that the instability is on the horizon, but also maybe a little bit of an anxiety that he can't quite trust the military the way you're supposed to be able to. So this is one of the narratives that we have of the historical origins of the police. There, Saliason's account of the slave patrols in America is another one. And I think these are happening close to each other, but alongside them are these werewolf crimes, which are not so many, right? There's enough of them that it's noticeable in a historical record, but not so many that, like, usually we refer to the witch trials as being much more significant. But the werewolf trials might be significant in another way. That is, it might sort of raise a particular kind of crime that starts to look so extreme that something like a private articulation of this danger and response to it might not be enough. So I want to say that there's something in that constellation that's forming. And
so you don't see it as a failure of confidence in private policing?
no, I think I do see that, but I think it's because the crimes are becoming of some sort. And then
And also the preventive.
right, exactly. But the preventative part comes
With slave patrols, or there's an anxiety, there's danger.
right, exactly. So their anxiety is brewing. The real preventative logic comes 100 years later when the Bow Street runners in London are involved in trying to detect crime and stop crime from happening before it starts. But there is before that the sort of symbolic structure of there is a police force if crime happens, like to keep order. And exactly. And so I think one of the things we also notice in the decline of private policing in the modern era is who could be responsible for that allegiance to the court. And we've already got this group of people who are monitoring the movement of goods and services. They're already on the road. And being on the road was itself a dangerous task, like in a space without clear law mitigating it. So I do think that the state's anxiety and the wealthy order's anxiety sort of merge into this origin story. So slave patrols are they're not mandated by the states, they're mandated by the plantation holders. And then the king is mandating the patrol of the harbor. So a lot of the early narratives sound like capital is certainly becoming anxious. And maybe that's involved in the werewolf narrative too. There's a sort of anxiety if crime like this starts to manifest itself, maybe capital won't be as secure.
It also strikes me too that the post-30 Years' War scenario that you're talking about in the middle of the 17th century, particularly Europe, where you're just seeing absolutely catastrophic.
Exactly. 30%.
Unbelievable predatory capacity, particularly from roving groups of mercenaries.
Exactly. So there was real anxiety.
That is really so that almost becomes a kind of watershed moment that's almost comparable to something like the Black Death as a kind of security issue. Right?
Exactly. I mean, so it's almost like you have the invention of the state and the invention of police almost simultaneously.
Yeah.
The nation state and the police somehow have this shared origin.
But that echoes Roncier too, doesn't it? Roncier says something similar about police and state there as well.
Yeah.
And your very final point, I thought, reminded me of something that Jean Baudrillard says when you were talking about how everything is destined to make war on its own referent.
Yeah.
The police begin by protecting citizens and end up seeing citizens as the very thing against which they have to protect themselves from. Right?
Yeah.
The police protect themselves from citizens. Right?
Yeah.
And that's a wonderful kind of version.
Yeah.
Reminds me of what Weber says about bureaucracy. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Superb. Are there any more questions?
Should we just read out Elise's comment?
Oh yes, Elise's
It's a
comment.
comment, not a question, but it's.
Yeah, sorry, Elise, who's recently submitted a PhD on dogs in classical Greece, which I think would be a superb contribution to scholarship, has said in the chat. The dog is a cool figure because the dog is in between wolf and man, has the ability to discern friend from foe. But what sets it apart as the ideal phylax or guardian is its capacity to always be learning, taking in its environments and adapting. And she's also said that there's a lot to think about in a very suggestive paper. So thanks, Elise.
That's great.
Yeah, and in the middle of your paper, I was ducking in and out of Beaks's etymological dictionary of Greek.
Yeah.
And it just occurs to me that, at least in the Proto-Indo-European or the Indo-European lexicon, kuon, the Greek word for dog, and likos, the Greek word for wolf, are radically different words. So the distinction out of the pastoral society, which early Indo-European, I imagine, which we can say Proto-Indo-European society was deeply nomadic, deeply pastoral. The distinction between the dog and the wolf is already hardwired into Proto-Indo-European.
Do we know
whatever,
at what point there's a consciousness of the evolutionary relationship between dogs and wolves? Because clearly there's not going to be an evolutionary account until
I would suspect that's Paleolithic.
but at what point are humans conscious that dogs are domesticated wolves? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, when's there a kind of discourse or acknowledgement, a common understanding that dogs are domesticated wolves, right? Because that's the history of the species, and we know that evolutionary kind of terms.
Well, I think that consciousness has only come sort of relatively recently.
Yeah.
With the identification that dogs and wolves share about 98%.
Yeah, okay.
DNA. Yeah.
So that sounds especially.
Our former head of school, Keith Dobney, is a paleofaunal archaeologist, and one of his areas is sort of in dog remains.
Oh.
And he was able to he's showed fairly convincingly that the dingo, which is the native dog in Australia, was actually brought with humans. So that the dingo was already kind of partly domesticated.
That's interesting. But what's also interesting is that they're not canine. Dingoes are not of wolves. They're co-evolutionary. There's
the Asian wild dog, the East Asian wild dog, or something like that, different species somewhere.
And I don't know what it evolved from, but it's an instance of convergent evolution. That's the modern biological term for it, where the animals have evolved in such likeness that there's a convergence of their evolution, but they're not actually evolved from the same species.
Yeah,
which is interesting.
it is. It's amazing. There's so much. I mean, there's a whole work on wolves that you've got buried in there. I think
big book.
Yeah. Look, it's after 11, and we've imposed on Andy quite a lot. Oh, hold on, we've also got.
How about I'll cut and paste that and send it to Andy.
Yeah. Well, look, it remains to me only just to thank Andy again for just an extraordinarily rich and suggestive paper, and it's really brought our Critical Antiquities workshop for the semester to a wonderful conclusion. So let's thank Andy again. Yeah, wonderful. Thanks everyone on Zoom, and we'll see you again in semester two. Stay posted for our semester two schedule, which will come out probably in July. But thanks for attending, everyone, and we'll see you after the break.
Thank you.
Cheers.